The fireplace at Grimmauld Place flared bright green, and Harry instinctively took a step back as Hermione appeared out of the emerald blaze. She came through in a neat swirl of soot and flame, clutching her beaded bag, her hair slightly mussed, but her posture somehow still composed. She brushed ash from her jumper with brisk, practiced motions, then turned on Harry with the exact look she wore whenever she was about to give instructions. "Speak clearly," she said, as if Harry hadn't used the flu network 100 times. "And don't forget your trunk this time." Harry grinned and hitched his bag higher on his shoulder. "That was once, Hermione. Once." "Twice," she corrected immediately. "There was fourth year, and then, are you two coming or not?" Ron's voice called from beyond the flames, impatient but unmistakably pleased. "Mum's got the kettle on, and she's threatening to send the ghoul after us if we're late for supper." Hermione moved aside, still looking faintly disapproving in the way only she could manage, while clearly being excited too. Harry scooped a handful of flu powder from the jar on the mantel. The dust felt cool and soft between his fingers, like glitter that didn't melt. The familiar fizz of magic ran up his arm as he tossed it into the fire. "The Burrow!" he called clearly, and stepped straight into the flames. The world spun into a blur of green and rushing air. It was the usual uncomfortable lurch like being yanked through a narrow tunnel at speed. Then, almost instantly, Harry stumbled out onto the worn rug in the Weasley sitting room. He caught himself before he fell flat, only to feel Ron's hand clamp his elbow to steady him. "Graceful as ever, mate," Ron said, but he was grinning. Harry barely had time to move away before Hermione stepped out after him. Somehow she managed to arrive with impeccable balance, as if she'd simply walked through a doorway rather than dropped out of a fireplace. Ron stared, half impressed, half offended. "How do you do that?" "Proper foot placement," Hermione replied primly, "and core balance." Harry snorted. Ron looked between them. "You know, normal people just arrive. You'd arrive better too if you listened," Hermione said, eyes bright with amusement. "I arrive fine," Harry said, still smiling. "Ron just likes complaining." "Harry simply needs a proper welcome," came a familiar voice, warm and bustling. Molly Weasley appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron, this one embroidered with small pumpkins that waddled across the fabric in an endless little parade. Before Harry could say anything, she pulled him into a hug that smelled like cinnamon, warm bread, and something sweet baking. "It's lovely to have you here, dear," she said, holding him back just far enough to inspect him like she was counting ribs. "You look thin. Doesn't Creature feed you properly at Grimmauld Place?" "He does," Mrs. Harry started. "Molly," she corrected. "Molly," she corrected automatically, and her mouth softened into that maternal look that always made Harry feel both seen and slightly terrified. "He does," Harry finished. "Honestly." Molly huffed as if she didn't believe him, then hugged Hermione just as tightly. "And you, Hermione, always a pleasure. Now you must both be starving. Supper's nearly ready, but I've got fresh scones if you want something to tide you over." Harry's chest eased the moment he stepped fully into the room. The Burrow always did that to him, wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. The sitting room was already dressed for Halloween. Paper bats hung near the ceiling, fluttering lazily with simple charm work. Dried cornstalks stood in corners, tied with orange ribbon. Through the window, dusk was settling over the orchard, turning the gnarled apple trees into dark silhouettes against a purple-gold sky. "Where's everyone?" Hermione asked, setting her bag neatly beside the sofa. "Dad's still at the ministry," Ron said, dropping into his usual spot with the ease of someone who belonged to a house in every creaky floorboard. Should be home any minute. Ginny's in the garden trying to catch gnomes. She's got this idea about dressing them up for tomorrow. Bill and Fleur are coming tomorrow afternoon, Molly added, already half-turned toward the kitchen, as if she could stir something from across the room by will alone. And Charlie sent his regrets from Romania. Hermione hesitated, then prompted softly. Percy? Molly's smile tightened, just briefly. Percy sent a very official note about ministry obligations. Silence tried to creep in, the way it sometimes did around that name. Ron broke it immediately, blunt as a hammer and twice as effective. And Fred and George. In their room, Molly said, in the voice Harry knew well, the one that meant she'd smelled mischief on the wind. They've been up there all afternoon. I've heard several suspicious bangs. They swear they're doing shop inventory, but I know those two. As if their names were a spell, twin thuds sounded overhead, followed by muffled laughter. A moment later, Fred and George stormed down the stairs like a matched pair of thunderstorms, both wearing identical grins. "Harry, old chap," Fred boomed. "And the lovely Hermione," George added with theatrical reverence. Perfect timing. They spoke in their usual rapid tandem, one sentence bouncing into the next without needing a pause. Harry felt his grin widen automatically. The twins looked delighted with themselves, which almost always meant they were about to improve everyone's day in the most chaotic way possible. Hermione's eyes narrowed. "What are you planning?" "Planning?" Fred clutched his chest as if stabbed. "We're wounded, Hermione." "Truly wounded," George agreed. "We're merely preparing to celebrate Halloween the proper way." "Which is?" Hermione asked, already knowing. "In the proud tradition of terrifying our beloved family members," Fred said. "Just enough to keep the spirit alive," George added. Nothing dangerous," Fred said quickly, catching Molly's look. "All tested, all safe," George said, just as fast. "Mostly safe," Fred amended. "Reasonably safe," Molly warned from the doorway, her tone sharp. "Perfectly safe, Mum," the twins chorused, wearing the kind of angelic innocence that had never fooled anyone in their lives. The kitchen timer chimed, saving Molly from saying what she clearly wanted to say. She disappeared back into the kitchen, muttering about never having a peaceful moment. The twins watched her go, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Actually," Fred said, dropping his voice, "we could use your help tomorrow." "Quality control," George explained, pulling a small velvet pouch from inside his robes. Hermione folded her arms. "I'm listening, unfortunately." George upended the pouch onto the coffee table. Brightly wrapped sweets and small oddities tumbled out, along with parchment covered in tight handwriting and little diagrams. "First," George said, holding up a shimmering square of fudge. "Phantom fudge." "Eat one," Fred said, "and you go transparent. Not invisible, see-through, like a proper ghost." "For 15 minutes," George added. "Long enough to spook someone. Not long enough to cause panic. Long enough for you two to get ideas," Hermione muttered. "Tested extensively," Fred insisted. "On ourselves." "Multiple times," George said. "And on Lee," Fred added. "Angelina," George said. "And Verity at the shop," Fred finished. Ron wandered back in and stared at the pile. "Can I try something?" Later, Fred said automatically, as if Ron was an impatient child waiting for sweets. Harry picked up the fudge and turned it in his fingers. It smelled like chocolate, with a hint of peppermint. He looked at Hermione. You're not seriously. I'm supervising, Hermione said, sinking into an armchair with a look that said she'd already lost but would lose properly. Harry unwrapped the fudge and ate it. It melted on his tongue, sweet and cool. Then the sensation hit, an odd, gentle tingling that spread through his mouth, down his neck, and into his chest, like a ripple passing through water. Harry blinked and looked down. His hands were fading, not vanishing, becoming glassy and pale, like they'd been made of fog and moonlight. He could see the carpet through his fingers. He lifted his hand higher and turned it, fascinated and unsettled all at once. Ron made a noise halfway between a laugh and a gasp. Bloody hell. Hermione leaned forward, eyes sharp. How do you feel? Any dizziness? Nausea? Vision changes? I feel. Harry flexed his fingers. Weird. But fine. Fred scribbled something on parchment. Excellent. Symptom report. Weird but fine. As George circled Harry like a scientist inspecting a creature. Can you feel solid? Touch something. Harry pressed his transparent hand to the arm of the chair. He felt the fabric, felt the pressure. Everything was normal, except how he looked. It's like being a walking window, he said. Exactly, Fred said, delighted. We inverted the principle of light obstruction. Instead of blocking light, we let it pass through organic matter temporarily. The clothes staying visible took ages, George said proudly. Early versions had people's robes floating around empty. Very unsettling. Hermione made a note in her head, clearly. And there's no lingering effect? 15 minutes, Fred said. Then you're back to normal. Harry walked across the room. It was deeply strange watching the floor show through his legs. He looked down at his chest and saw faint outlines. Nothing too graphic, just an eerie suggestion of depth. Terrifying, Ron said appreciatively. I love it. Terrifying is seasonal, George said. That's the marketing angle. Next, Fred announced, producing a tiny vial. Ghostly gazes. Eye drops, Hermione said flatly. 2 drops, and your eyes glow in the dark for an hour. George explained. No effect on vision. I'm not putting unknown liquids in my eyes, Hermione said immediately. Ron raised his hand. I will. After dark, Fred said, so we can admire your glowing eyeballs properly. And now, George said, holding up a small rubbery sphere with runes etched into it, and a faint purple pulse, our personal favorite, spectopheres. Hermione reached for it before anyone else could. She examined the runes, the charm pattern, the little steady throb of contained magic. This is actually clever, she admitted, sounding annoyed at herself for saying it. Thank you, the twins said together, pleased. You throw it, Fred explained, and it creates a harmless phantom, one that tells awful jokes, George added. For 5 minutes, awful jokes? Ron repeated. Magnificently awful, Fred said. Hermione stood, gave the sphere a cautious toss toward the center of the room, and it bounced once on the rug. Purple smoke poured out, thick and swirling, then gathered itself into a vague humanoid shape, translucent, grinning, with bright, glowing eyes. The phantom cleared its throat dramatically. Good evening, it intoned in a hollow, echoing voice. Why don't ghosts like rain? It paused, as if savoring the moment. Because it dampens their spirits, Ron groaned. Harry laughed anyway. The phantom kept going, circling slowly as if performing on a stage. What's a ghost's favorite dessert? Ice cream! Why are graveyards so noisy? Because of all the coffin. The jokes were awful, truly awful. And the longer it went on, the harder it became not to laugh, especially when the phantom seemed proud of itself. When it finally dissolved back into purple smoke, Hermione sat again, shaking her head. These are dreadful, she said. That's the whole point, Fred said, delighted. They spent the next hour going through the rest. Howling hats, creeping cobwebs that spread dramatically then vanished, midnight mints that turned tongues black, tiny prank trinkets that squeaked or hissed on cue. Hermione asked careful questions about reversibility and duration. The twins answered with surprising seriousness beneath their jokes. We've got standards, George insisted. Ethical guidelines, Fred said. Nothing that lasts more than a few hours, George added. And nothing that can't be reversed with a simple, finite, Fred finished. Molly's voice called from the kitchen, breaking their little test lab. Boys! I need help bringing in the corn stalks. The twins swept their products back into the velvet pouch. Not a word, Fred whispered to Harry. She knows you test things, Hermione said. Not on Harry, George whispered back. Harry lifted both hands in surrender. I won't tell. Neither will I, Hermione said, unless your safety protocols are ridiculous. The afternoon became a blur of decorating. Cornstalks, ribbon, enchanted leaves that swirled, as if dancing to music only they could hear. Arthur returned from the ministry, robes a little crooked, glasses askew, but smiling broadly. He immediately began improving the pumpkin formation outside, with the earnest intensity of a man applying logic where none was needed. Optimal viewing angles, he explained seriously. Ginny rolled her eyes. Dad, they're pumpkins. They're floating pumpkins, Arthur corrected, as if that settled everything. By the time dusk deepened, the garden looked like a storybook. The pumpkins drifted lazily, ready to glow as soon as the light fully fell. Fairy lights twinkled along ivy. Paper bats waited under the eaves like they were asleep. Supper was another Molly Weasley masterpiece. Roast, potatoes, vegetables, rolls so warm steam rose when you tore them open. The kitchen's ceiling had been charmed with miniature pumpkins that bobbed like lanterns, glowing soft orange. Harry ate until he felt human again. The noise, the laughter, the easy chatter jumping from Quidditch to ministry gossip to Hermione's enchanting theory, it all pressed warmth into him, like a hand on his shoulder. Afterward, they migrated to the sitting room. Molly brought mugs of cider that smelled like apples and spice. The fire popped and cracked. Outside, the pumpkins began to glow. Ooh, tomorrow's going to be busy, Molly said, settling into her chair, her knitting needles clicking on their own. Breakfast, final enchantments, Arthur's story session, and then supper before the twins unleash whatever they've promised not to unleash. We promise nothing, Fred said. We promise we'll probably behave, George corrected. Bill and Fleur should arrive around 2, Molly continued. It'll be nice having everyone. Almost everyone, her voice didn't say, but the shadow flickered and passed. Hermione, tactful as ever, shifted the conversation. What do wizarding families usually do for Halloween? I know the history, Savin, the veil thinning, but what do people actually do? It depends, Arthur said with the delighted air of someone given permission to lecture. Some families still do offerings for ancestors, but most people do what we do. Decorate, eat, tell stories, gather. It's become important. After the war, he didn't need to say. Harry understood. They weren't ignoring what Halloween had been for him. They were reclaiming it. turning it into something that didn't ache. Molly clapped her hands briskly. Right, bed, all of you. We're starting early, and I will not have a household full of exhausted teenagers. They obeyed, mostly. Upstairs, Ron's room was the same comfortable mess as always. Posters, Quidditch magazines, clothes everywhere. Harry settled onto the camp bed Molly had set up, listening to the Burrow's night sounds. The ghoul thumping, floorboards creaking, the soft hush of an old house full of life. Through the window, stars dotted the October sky. Tomorrow would be Halloween. For once, Harry felt like it might be okay. Morning at the Burrow arrived like a friendly attack. Frying bacon, clattering pans, the smell of toast, and Molly's voice rising up the stairs with cheerful menace. Breakfast in 10 minutes. Don't make me send the twins up there. Harry blinked awake, momentarily confused by the slanted ceiling and the orange-painted walls, then remembered where he was. Ron was still buried under blankets, only a tuft of red hair showing. Harry grabbed a pillow and lobbed it. Ron made a muffled noise and flailed. Goff.
Mum said she'll send Fred and George, Harry warned.
That worked. Ron shot upright like he'd been hexed. Right, fine, coming. Downstairs, the kitchen was already humming. Molly managed multiple pans at once like it was nothing. Eggs scrambling themselves, bacon sizzling, toast popping up into a rack that caught each slice and buttered it automatically. Hermione sat at the table with tea, looking unfairly awake, a book propped open beside her plate. Morning, she said brightly. Molly was explaining sustained levitation charms. Did you know you have to account for temperature shifts or the object's drift? Ron sagged into a chair. I haven't even had breakfast. Ginny appeared, already dressed, hair pulled back, looking like she'd been awake since sunrise. Dad's gone early, she announced. Something at the ministry about an enchanted alarm clock screaming instead of ringing. He'll be back. Where are Fred and George? Harry asked, noticing the unusual lack of chaos. Molly cracked an egg with a sharp motion. Still asleep. I checked earlier. They were snoring among enough merchandise to stock a shop. Ginny's mouth twitched. Want me to wake them? Yes, please. Ginny disappeared upstairs with a grin that did not bode well for anyone with dignity. Moments later, a yelp, some very creative swearing, and the unmistakable sound of water splattering. Ginny returned, satisfied. Cold aguamenti. You're welcome. Fred and George stumbled down after, hair damp, faces full of offended admiration. Well played, Fred said. You've learned from masters, George agreed. I've learned how to survive you, Ginny replied sweetly. After breakfast, Molly herded them outside. The morning air was crisp and smelled of damp soil and late roses clinging stubbornly to the fence. In the pumpkin patch, Arthur's pride and joy, pumpkins ranged from small and perfect to enormous ones that looked like they'd swallowed other pumpkins for breakfast. Arthur's been singing to them, Molly said, eyeing the crop like a general approving troops. Read it in a Muggle gardening magazine. Hermione's eyes lit up. Hermione's eyes lit up. Does that actually work? Molly shrugged. But they turned out well, didn't they? They carried pumpkins to the lawn, selecting about 20 similar ones for floating, and setting the larger ones aside as garden centerpieces. Once they had a neat line, Molly raised her wand. Right, she said. 3 spells, layered. Levitation, movement, and internal glow. First, Wingardium Leviosa. A pumpkin lifted cleanly, hovering at head height. Then you add the wandering pattern, Molly continued, tracing a smooth figure. 8. Vegas Fluito. The pumpkin drifted in a lazy, natural path, not stiff or mechanical. And finally, illumination, Molly said, tapping the pumpkin gently. Not limos, too harsh. Lux interna. Picture warm candlelight, orange gold. The pumpkin lit from within, glowing soft and welcoming. Hermione stepped forward, eager. Her levitation was perfect. Her wandering charm took 2 tries, first too straight, then smooth. Her glow was beautiful. Ginny did all 3 in minutes, effortless from years of practice. Ron's first wandering attempt sent the pumpkin shooting sideways, like it had somewhere to be. It nearly clipped Fred's ear. "Oi!" Fred barked. "Sorry!" Ron hauled it back down. "It's harder than it looks. Slow your wand," Molly instructed, guiding him. "Let the motion do the work." Harry found himself unexpectedly enjoying it. The magic wasn't defensive or sharp. It wasn't about survival. It was about making something lovely. Once he got his figurehead steady, his pumpkin floated calmly and glowed warmly, bobbing like a lantern. Fred and George, of course, finished quickly and immediately started experimenting. One pumpkin glowed green, another pulsed like a heartbeat. "Boys," Molly warned. "Traditional colors," Fred said, sighing as if forced to abandon his art. They worked through the morning, and the garden slowly filled with drifting orange lights. The sight made Harry's chest feel loose and light at the same time. When Molly called a break, she brought pumpkin juice and biscuits, and they sat on the grass watching their pumpkins patrol the air like friendly, lazy guardians. Arthur returned around midday, delighted by the progress, and immediately began fussing with optimal pumpkin distribution. Nobody argued with him because it was easier to let him be happy. Lunch came and went, and then the afternoon brought the twins testing again. Phantom fudge, glowing eyes after dark, and more laughter than Harry realized he'd needed. By evening, the burrow was transformed. The pumpkins glowed properly now, warm pools of orange drifting over the grass. The fairy lights sparkled. Enchanted leaves swirled. Paper bats lifted from their roosts and swept the eaves. At exactly 2, the Flu roared, and Bill stepped out, tall and grinning, his dragonhide jacket dusty from travel. Fleur followed, elegant as ever, looking like she'd never had Ash touch her in her life. Molly hugged them both fiercely. Bill's grin widened when he saw the decorations. "This looks brilliant. It's cozy," Fleur said, searching for the right word and finding it with a pleased smile. At Beauxbatons, Halloween was formal. This is better. As the day slid toward night, the kitchen became a command center. Molly cooked like she was feeding an army. Cauldron cakes cooled. Pumpkin pie waited under a preservation charm. Color-shifting jellies wobbled in glass bowls, cycling through orange, purple, and deep midnight black. When the sky finally turned fully dark, the garden became a lantern-lit dream. The pumpkins glowed like small suns. The fairy lights shimmered. The burrow itself looked like it was smiling. Dinner was enormous and loud and perfect. They talked over roast and rolls and Molly's strange green witch's brew soup that somehow tasted fantastic. Bill told curse-breaking stories. Ron teased him. Hermione asked questions that made Bill laugh, and Fleur look impressed. Arthur tried to bring up Muggle washing machines until Molly shut him down with a look. Then, when plates were being cleared, Fred and George struck. Portraits began speaking in spooky, dramatic voices. One started a ghost story, another continued it, and soon the entire house was participating like it had rehearsed. Sheets floated out of cupboards, harmless and theatrical, wooing softly as they glided through the sitting room. Tiny sparks popped into existence, green, orange, purple, vanishing before they touched anything. Molly's hands went to her hips. Boys! Harmless, Fred promised. Atmospheric, George added. The portraits kept going, telling a ridiculous tale full of dramatic pauses and terrible puns. The room filled with laughter. Later, as the clock edged toward 11, the twins disappeared upstairs again, exchanging those silent twin glances that always meant trouble had reached its final stage. At 11:30, they returned in matching black robes, wands ready. Witches and wizards, Fred announced grandly. Ladies and gentlemen, George continued, we present, they said together, the Midnight Mischief Spectacular. I am fatiguer, and I am too full fair for death. They cast in perfect sync. Golden magic spilled through the burrow like liquid light, soaking into the walls, the floor, the very bones of the house. The portrait shifted, not just speaking now, but acting, turning into a full performance, a comedy about ghosts frightened of an over-friendly family. The house itself contributed, creaking footsteps timed like percussion, wind noises, little harmless bangs for drama. Outside, the pumpkins stopped wandering randomly and began to move in patterns, slow, coordinated arcs like a floating ballet. Hermione stared, half laughing, half stunned. How did you synchronize this? Portrait magic and object enchantments operate differently. Trade secret, the twins said, smug. The countdown began. The house's music swelled. The portraits reached the climax of their play. The sheets spun into glowing spirals. The sparks pulsed to a rhythm that made Harry's skin prickle with anticipation. At midnight, everything hit at once. The enchanted sheets burst outward in a harmless shower of light, briefly forming Halloween shapes, bats, jack-o'-lanterns, cats, then drifted down like confetti. The sparks gathered into a brilliant point and exploded into color that vanished before it touched a thing. Outside, the pumpkins shot outward in a radiant pattern and slowly returned to their gentle drift, the whole garden breathing out like it had been holding its breath. The portraits applauded, the family applauded, even Arthur cheered, delighted beyond words. Molly looked at the twins like she wanted to scold them and hug them at the same time. That was spectacular. The twins beamed. Harry sat back, hot chocolate warming his hands, the Weasleys' laughter around him like firelight. For once, Halloween didn't feel like a wound. It felt like home. The house didn't go silent right away after midnight. The Burrow never did. Even when the laughter faded and everyone started yawning, it still felt like the walls were holding on to the last bits of magic. The way warm air lingers after you close an oven door. The portraits whispered among themselves, clearly pleased with their performance. Somewhere upstairs, a cupboard door clicked shut as a stubborn sheet finally surrendered and went back where it belonged. Molly stood in the middle of the sitting room with her hands on her hips, pretending she was stern. She wasn't fooling anyone. Right, she said, voice firm but soft around the edges. It's past midnight. Bed. Every single one of you. Ron pushed himself upright from the sofa, like it took all his strength. I'm already halfway asleep. You've been halfway asleep since dinner, Ginny told him. Bill stretched in his chair, Fleur tucked close beside him. Fred and George were still buzzing with pride, grinning like they'd just won something important. Hermione had her wand out, doing little diagnostic charms at the air, as if she could trap the leftover magic in a jar for study. Arthur sat in his favorite chair, glasses slightly crooked, looking delighted and tired all at once. Harry stayed seated a moment longer, watching the warm glow from the fire and the way the last few sparks faded into nothing. Outside the window, the pumpkins had returned to their gentle drifting. They were back to being what Molly had intended all along. Soft, orange lights keeping watch, not a spectacle, just a comfort. Ginny nudged Harry with her shoulder. "You okay?" Harry blinked, then nodded. "Yeah, just. That was brilliant." Ginny smiled, small and satisfied. "Good." They all drifted upstairs in a slow, sleepy procession. The Burrow stairs creaked under their feet, as if the house was sighing and settling down too. Portraits on the walls yawned or waved them along, and a small photo of young Ron pulling a face at the camera wriggled on its frame as they passed. In Ron's room, Ron didn't even bother changing properly. He collapsed onto his bed and within minutes was snoring, soft at first, then louder, like a sore warming up. "Honestly," Hermione whispered, pulling her hair out of her face, "how does he fall asleep that quickly?" "It's a talent," Harry said, keeping his voice low. He climbed into the camp bed Molly had set up beside Ron's, the blankets thick and warm. For a while, Harry lay there listening. The house made its usual night noises, a distant thump from the attic where the ghoul lived, a soft creak as something settled, the faint rustle of wind outside. Through the window, one drifting pumpkin passed by, its orange glow sliding across the glass like a slow-moving lantern. Harry closed his eyes with a strange feeling in his chest. Something like relief, something like gratitude, and something like peace. When morning came, it arrived gently. No midnight drama, no wild sparks, just pale gold sunlight spilling across the room and the smell of breakfast drifting up the stairs. Harry lay still for a moment, watching dust motes spin in the light. Halloween was technically over. It was November 1st now, yet the warmth from yesterday hadn't vanished. It clung to him like the last notes of a song you don't want to end. Ron was still buried under his covers. Harry smiled, climbed out of bed quietly, and headed downstairs. The kitchen was calmer than yesterday's feast frenzy, but Molly was already moving like she'd never stopped. She stood at the stove in her dressing gown, hair loose and a little messy, stirring porridge while the kettle hovered nearby under a levitation charm. She looked tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a job well done. "Morning, dear," she said, glancing up. "You're up early. Sleep all right?" "Really well," Harry said, and it was true. "Do you need help, Molly?" Waved him away with a fond look. "Sit. Have tea." "I'm fine." Harry poured tea and took a seat. From the kitchen window, he could see the garden in daylight. It looked different without darkness, less dramatic, more ordinary. The floating pumpkins were still there, but their glow didn't show in the sun. The fairy lights looked like normal ivy again. The paper bats hung still under the eaves like scraps of folded black paper, waiting for night. "It's strange," Harry said quietly. "How different it looks in the morning." "Magic often does," Molly replied, setting a bowl of porridge in front of him. "Night makes everything feel bigger, more enchanted. But there's something nice about seeing it in daylight, too. It reminds you it was real." Harry nodded, spooning porridge absently. They sat in a comfortable silence that didn't demand filling. Outside, a garden gnome scuttled past wearing one of Ginny's tiny hats, the ridiculous little thing tilted over one ear. Harry's mouth twitched. Then the words came out before he could stop them. "Thank you," he said. Molly looked up. "For what, dear?" Harry swallowed. For Halloween." "Bears." "For making it different." Molly's hands paused for just a moment. Then she reached across the table and patted his fingers. Her eyes were bright in a way she pretended not to notice. "Oh, Harry," she said softly. "Your family. This is what family does." Harry stared down into his tea, the steam curling. "Halloween will always be complicated for me," he admitted, "because of my parents, because of everything that happened. But yesterday, it helped. It gave me something else to remember." "Ah." Molly's voice was gentle but firm, like she was laying a blanket over something fragile. "That's what we wanted. Arthur and I talked about it. We can't change the past. But we can give you better memories to carry alongside it." "The twins," Harry began. Molly huffed a small laugh, half exasperation, half pride. "They've been planning that midnight show since August. Testing things, scribbling notes, spending money they should have saved. I told them off twice. It didn't help. They wanted to do something special." Harry's throat tightened, and he blinked hard. "I don't know what I did to deserve you all," he said honestly. Molly's expression didn't soften. It sharpened, as if she refused to let him doubt it. "You survived. You kept choosing what was right even when it hurt. You loved people, and you let them love you. That's enough." Footsteps on the stairs saved Harry from replying. Hermione appeared, hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes half yawning but still alert. She wore a slightly oversized Weasley jumper that looked like it belonged there. "Morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Is that porridge?" "Brilliant." Ginny followed next, then Arthur, surprisingly energetic, then Bill and Fleur. Ron stumbled in last, drawn by food like a sleepwalking animal. Breakfast was slow and cozy. They talked about the night before in sleepy pieces, smiling at memories that were still fresh. The twins didn't appear until almost 11. When they finally shuffled in, hair sticking up and faces rumpled, everyone turned to stare. "What?" Fred demanded. George yawned. "It takes a lot of effort to be magnificent." Hermione immediately leaned towards them like she'd been waiting for this all night. "I want to see the notes for the synchronization charm." Fred blinked. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious," Hermione said. George looked mildly alarmed. "That's true. Show her the notes," Ron muttered, shoving toast in his mouth. "Maybe it'll distract her from lecturing us about safety." Hermione shot him a look. "You should be grateful I care." "You care aggressively," Ron said, but he was smiling. Then the real work began. Cleanup at the Burrow wasn't quiet, but it was satisfying. Everyone pitched in, moving around each other like they'd done it 1,000 times. Decorations came down in piles. Ribbons untied, cornstalks bundled, enchanted leaves released to scatter naturally. Some magic didn't want to quit. A single sheet kept floating away whenever someone tried to stuff it back into the linen cupboard, like it had decided it belonged to the air now. A few paper bats clung stubbornly to their roost under the eaves, refusing to be banished. "This one's got attitude," Bill said, coaxing a bat down. "We are not keeping enchanted paper as pets," Molly said firmly, though her mouth twitched like she was trying not to laugh. The pumpkins took the most care. Each one had 3 charms layered together, and Hermione insisted they remove them properly, one at a time, in the correct order. "If you strip them all at once," she warned Harry as they worked side by side, "the magic fields can collide." "What happens if they collide?" Harry asked, lowering a pumpkin gently to the ground. "Nothing dangerous," Hermione said. "Just chaos." "You might get spirals," Flashing colors, odd noises. Ron perked up. Odd noises? Hermione nodded gravely. I read about a wizard who removed his pumpkin charms wrong and it sang opera for 3 hours. Harry grinned. That sounds kind of amazing. It was Wagner, Hermione said seriously. Very loud Wagner. Hmm. Hmm. Ron groaned. Never mind. Molly sorted the de-enchanted pumpkins into neat stacks. Soup and pies, she declared, pleased. Waste no. Fred and George collected their own evidence. Spectopheres, wrappers, leftover prank bits, moving through the house with bags like they were cleaning up a crime scene. Found one still active, George said, holding up a faintly pulsing sphere. Keep it, Fred decided instantly. Future demonstration. By early afternoon, the Burrow was mostly back to normal. The garden looked like a garden again. The fairy lights were carefully coaxed into containers. The tiny fairies complaining in high voices about being put away. You'll be out again next year, Molly promised them patiently. One pumpkin remained. It floated near the kitchen window, still glowing softly, even in daylight. A gentle point of orange warmth, like a candle that refused to go out. Arthur raised his eyebrows. Just the one. Just the one, Molly said. And that was the end of it. Lunch was leftovers, turkey and vegetables, and somehow it tasted even better the next day. Everyone ate with the slow contentment of people who'd worked hard and were now pleasantly tired. Then Bill and Fleur had to leave. There were hugs, last-minute reminders, and promises to visit soon. They stepped into the flue and vanished in a swirl of green flame. Fred and George announced they had to get back to the shop and disappeared shortly after, still smugly pleased with their own brilliance. With the house quieter again, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny ended up back in the sitting room, sprawled comfortably while Molly and Arthur finished the last bits of tidying. That was the best Halloween we've had in years, Ron said, stretching. Harry looked toward the window where the single pumpkin glowed steady and warm. The best ever, he corrected softly. Ginny glanced at him. Hermione's expression turned gentle, like she understood exactly why he'd said it that way. The afternoon drifted toward evening. Dinner was simple. Soup and bread, nothing fancy. Arthur told one more story about Muggle technology he'd forgotten to include in his Halloween lecture, and Molly shook her head fondly through the whole thing. Later, as Harry packed his bag to return to Grimmauld Place the next morning, he paused at Ron's window again. Outside the garden was dark, and the only light was that single preserved pumpkin glowing in the kitchen window. One small, orange beacon against the November night. Harry thought, as he always did, of his parents. But this time, the thought didn't crush him the way it sometimes did. It came with something else beside it. The sound of laughter, the sight of pumpkins dancing in the sky, the feeling of being wanted. He realized quietly that his parents would have wanted this for him. Warmth, family, peace of faith, a place to belong. You all right? Ron asked from behind him, wrestling a pile of socks into a bag with far too much aggression. Yeah, Harry said, and it was true. Just thinking how lucky I am. Ron stopped, surprisingly serious. We're the lucky ones, mate. Mum said so. This morning, Harry swallowed hard. I'm lucky to be part of it. That night, Harry lay on the camp bed, listening to the Burrow settle. Ron snoring. The ghouls' distant banging, the soft creak of the house, the whisper of magic that seemed soaked into every bit of wood and stone. Through the window, the preserved pumpkin's glow was still visible, steady, patient, warm. Tomorrow he'd go back to Grimmauld Place and his own life. But he'd carry this with him, the memory of a Halloween filled so full of light and love that there'd be no room left for shadows to sit. And as sleep took him, Harry smiled. Next Halloween, he'd come back. And the one after that. And all the ones still waiting, bright as pumpkin light and strong as family. The day after, and the road back, Harry woke before anyone else the next morning, not because he had to, but because his body had learned to do it. Even in a house that felt safe, some part of him still listened for danger, the way you listened for a kettle to boil. He lay there for a moment anyway, staring at the slanted ceiling, letting himself remember that the only thing waiting downstairs was Molly's breakfast and Arthur's cheerful questions and the normal creaks of an old magical home. Ron was asleep in the bed, sprawled like a starfish, one arm flung over his pillow. The faint snore he made was almost comforting. Harry dressed quietly, folded the blanket back into a neat square the way Molly liked, and then paused at the window. The garden had been mostly restored to ordinary November, but ordinary at the Burrow was still full of small life. The compost heap steamed faintly. The apple tree stood bare and patient. Somewhere near the shed, a gnome scuttled across the path wearing a tiny orange hat that kept sliding down over its eyes. It stopped, yanked the hat back up with an offended little gesture, and carried on as though dignity mattered greatly to gnomes. In the kitchen, Molly was already moving about, her slippers scuffing softly, her wand making the kettle lift and settle, as if it were breathing. She looked up when Harry came in, and smiled in that way that made you feel like you hadn't just arrived, but returned. "Morning, dear," she said. "Tea, please," Harry replied, and the word came out warmer than he expected. She poured him a cup without asking how he took it, because she already knew, and slid a plate of toast toward him like it had been waiting there. The preserved pumpkin still floated near the window, its glow faint in daylight, but steady. It drifted a few inches, bumped gently against the curtain, and then corrected itself, like it was trying to behave. Molly noticed Harry looking at it. "I'm going to keep that one until it fades," she said, as if she were explaining why she'd left a vase of flowers out. "Just a little reminder." "It's a good reminder," Harry said. Molly's expression softened, the busy part of her face easing for a moment. "I know you'll be going back today," she said, keeping her voice light. "But you can always come here when you need to. You know that." Harry nodded. He did know, but knowing and believing were sometimes different things, and the Burrow had a way of making belief feel possible. The house woke gradually. Hermione came down next, hair still messy, wearing one of the old Weasley jumpers like it belonged to her now. Ginny followed, bright-eyed and already dressed, and then Arthur appeared, looking pleased with himself for being awake at all, as if that alone was a triumph. Fred and George did not appear until much later, drifting in like two guilty cats who'd stayed out all night and expected to be admired for it. They ate slowly, talking about nothing urgent. Hermione asked Arthur more careful questions about the internet, and then gave up halfway through because Arthur had begun comparing it to the flu network, and once Arthur was in a comparison mood, there was no stopping him. Ron argued with Ginny about which Quidditch formation was superior, though it was less an argument than a ritual they both enjoyed. Bill and Fleur had already left the night before, but Molly had kept their mugs on the counter, as though they might step back through the fire at any moment. By late morning it was time. Harry's bag sat by the door, and Hermione's beaded bag hung from her shoulder, looking far too small for what it carried. Ron kept finding reasons to delay, checking his pockets, forgetting his jumper, going upstairs and coming down again with nothing new. Molly watched all of it with the patience of someone who understood that leaving was always the hardest part of a good day. Arthur clapped Harry on the shoulder. "Come back soon," he said, earnest as ever. "And do tell me if you come across any other Muggle devices. I've been reading about something called a blender. It appears to liquefy food with spinning blades. It sounds dangerous, Harry said solemnly. Arthur's eyes lit up. Exactly. Hermione hugged Molly properly, long and tight, murmuring something that made Molly's eyes go bright again. Ginny hugged Harry quickly at first, then seemed to think better of it and hugged him harder. Don't disappear, she said, low enough that only he heard. I won't, Harry promised. It was a simple sentence, but he meant it like an oath. Ron walked them to the fireplace and handed Harry a pinch of flower powder, like it was something precious. Don't fall on your face, Ron said. I'll do my best, Harry replied. And then, because he couldn't help it, he added, no promises. They stepped into the green flames, spoke clearly, and the burrow vanished in a whirl of heat and spinning. Grimmauld Place was quieter, in a different way. The silence there was older, sharper around the edges, like it belonged to the walls and not the people inside them. The fire spat them out into the drawing room, and Harry felt the familiar shift in his chest, like his lungs had remembered how to hold themselves in a house that didn't quite want him. Hermione brushed off her sleeves, glanced around, and then, without comment, reached into her bag and pulled out two small objects. She placed them on the side table, as if she were decorating. One was a tiny carved pumpkin that glowed softly. The other was a sprig of dried orange ribbon, tied in a neat bow. Just something, she said when Harry looked at her. Harry's throat tightened. Thanks. You're welcome, Hermione said briskly, because she never knew what to do with feelings unless she could organize them into steps. Then she looked around again. Right. We should make a list of what needs doing today. Boo, and they did, because that was what Hermione did best. She took the shapeless mass of life and turned it into something you could hold. There were errands, letters to answer, a meeting at the ministry Harry couldn't avoid, and a stack of paperwork that seemed to breed whenever he wasn't looking. There was also, Hermione insisted, time set aside for lunch, and not the kind of lunch where you forgot to eat until your stomach hurt. Creature appeared at the edge of the room like a shadow with ears. His eyes flicked to Harry and Hermione, then to the little carved pumpkin Hermione had placed on the table. Creature will not have glowing vegetables in the drawing room, he rasped automatically. It's not a vegetable, Hermione said, and then paused, because she wasn't entirely sure if pumpkins counted. It's decorative. Creature's mistress would not allow... Creature began. Creature, Harry interrupted, and there was no anger in his voice, only tired authority. It stays. Creature's mouth tightened. He looked at Harry as though trying to decide whether to argue. Then he gave a stiff little bow. As master commands, he said, and vanished with a crack. Hermione watched the spot where he disappeared. Progress, she said. Harry smiled faintly. He didn't insult you. Give it time, Hermione replied, but she looked pleased anyway. The day moved forward. Grimmauld Place stayed itself, gloomy and proud and full of old history, but the little pumpkin glow on the table made the room feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people lived. Harry found himself glancing at it when he passed through, as if checking that the warmth was still there. At the ministry, the building was busy in the way it always was. People hurrying, owls fluttering, notices changing themselves mid-sentence because the situation had changed again. Harry had never imagined that, after everything, the enemy would be paperwork. But it turned out that rebuilding a broken world involved more forms than duels. He met with Kingsley briefly, and with a few others whose names were becoming familiar. People who wanted to do things properly, who spoke about policy and protections, and the careful work of making sure the darkness didn't find cracks to slip through. Harry listened, answered where he could. and tried not to let himself feel overwhelmed by the sheer weight of it all. When he left the meeting, he found himself pausing in the atrium, looking up at the statues. They'd been replaced, repaired, altered. The old one that had celebrated power and dominance was gone. In its place was something more complicated, something that showed witches and wizards standing together, hands outstretched, not above anyone but alongside. Harry didn't know how to feel about it. Symbols mattered, but so did the everyday. So did Molly's toast and Ron's ridiculous snore, and a carved pumpkin on a table in a house that used to feel like a cage. He walked out into the grey London afternoon and breathed in air that tasted like rain and chimney smoke. For a moment, the world felt almost normal, which was its own strange kind of magic. Back at Grimmauld Place, Hermione was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, arguing gently with Creature about the correct number of onions to put in a stew. Creature has cooked for the House of Black for decades, Creature hissed. And I've read 3 cookbooks, Hermione replied. As if that settled it, Harry leaned in the doorway, watching them, and something in him eased. It was absurd, really. A war hero, a brilliant witch, and a house elf fighting about onions. But it was life. It was the kind of small, ordinary conflict that meant you were alive to have it. Hermione spotted him. Sit, she ordered. You look like you forgot how to be a person again. Harry sat. The stew was good. Creature refused to admit it was good because Hermione had helped. Hermione refused to admit it was good because Creature had been right about the onions. Harry ate 2 bowls and let them both have their pride. That night, Hermione left for her parents' house, promising to return the next day, and Harry found himself alone in Grimmauld Place again, with only Creatures muttering in the distance, and the house settling around him like an old coat. He went into the drawing room and sat by the fire. The carved pumpkin still glowed softly, warm and steady. Harry stared at it for a long time, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of parchment he'd forgotten he had. It was a shopping list Molly had pressed into his hand without thinking. Flour, cinnamon, extra butter, more tea, because Arthur had accidentally used half the tin trying to test a Muggle teabag contraption, and a note at the bottom that simply said, "Don't forget, you're always welcome." Harry read that line twice, then a third time. The house creaked above him, and the sound made his shoulders tense automatically. He forced himself to relax, to stay where he was, to let the warmth from the fire reach his hands. For years, Halloween had been something that happened to him, a date stamped on his life like a bruise. But this year, Halloween had been something he'd lived through with laughter. It didn't erase anything. It didn't change what had happened. But it added something new beside it, like placing a candle next to a shadow. Harry didn't know if he'd ever stop feeling that twist in his stomach when October came around. But he could imagine a future where he didn't dread it. A future where he looked forward to floating pumpkins and terrible jokes and Arthur telling stories with the complete confidence of a man who believed toasters were plotting. He sat there until the fire burned low, and the carved pumpkin's glow became the brightest thing in the room. In the days that followed, life filled in around the memory. Hermione was busy. Ron was busy. Ginny was busy. Everyone was rebuilding, each in their own way. Sometimes rebuilding looked like new laws and repaired buildings. Sometimes it looked like learning how to laugh again without flinching afterward. Harry visited the Burrow again sooner than he'd expected. Not for a holiday, not for an event, just for an afternoon. He arrived to find Molly in the garden, hands in the soil, scolding a gnome as if it were a misbehaving toddler. Arthur was in the shed, tinkering with something that whirred in a way that suggested he'd acquired another Muggle device.
Is that a blender?
Harry asked, stepping into the garden. Arthur froze, then looked guilty in the way only Arthur could look guilty, while still being delighted. It might be, he admitted. Molly's head snapped up. Arthur! I only wanted to understand how it works, Arthur said defensively. It's for research. For disaster, Molly corrected. But she was smiling. Harry laughed, and the sound surprised him with how easy it felt. They drank tea in the kitchen, and Molly sent Harry home with leftovers and a new jumper because she couldn't help herself. She also sent him with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, a little something, she said, as though she were passing him a loaf of bread. Harry opened it later at Grimmauld Place and found a string of tiny pumpkin lights, enchanted to glow softly and drift just slightly, like a gentler version of the ones in the garden. A note was tucked inside, for when the house feels too quiet. Harry hung them in the drawing room that same night. When they lit up, the old curtains looked less severe, the dark wood less heavy. Creature complained, of course, but his complaints had begun to sound less like hatred and more like habit. Harry could live with habit. Habit could be softened. Habit could be changed. As November deepened and the world moved toward winter, the memory of Halloween stayed with Harry like a hand on his shoulder. Not a weight, but a steady presence, a reminder that people had looked at a day tied to grief and decided to make it gentle instead. Sometimes Harry still woke up too early, heart racing, convinced something was wrong. Sometimes the past rose up without warning, sharp as ever. But now, when that happened, he had places to go in his mind that weren't only dark corridors and green light. He could see floating pumpkins in a garden, glowing against the night like lanterns that refused to go out. He could hear Molly laughing despite herself. He could hear Ron groaning at terrible jokes. He could feel Hermione's steady presence beside him, not letting him drift too far into silence. And when October came again, and the air began to smell like leaf smoke and cold earth, Harry knew he would still think of his parents. He would still feel that ache. He would never stop missing them. But he would also think of the Burrow, and the way the windows glowed warm against the dark. He would think of a family that had chosen to fill a hard day with light. He would think of love that didn't fix everything, but made it bearable. That, he realized, was what healing looked like. Not forgetting, not pretending. Just adding warmth, year by year, memory by memory, until the darkness didn't get to be the only thing you remembered. One evening near the end of November, Harry came home from the ministry to find a letter waiting on the hall table. The handwriting was Ginny's, slanted and confident. He opened it in the drawing room, under the soft glow of Molly's pumpkin lights. It wasn't a long letter. Ginny never wrote long letters, unless she had something important to say. It said, "Christmas planning has begun. Mum is already terrifying. Fred and George have ideas. Ron is complaining. Hermione is making lists. I'm warning you now, so you can't pretend you didn't know. Come to the Burrow next weekend. Don't argue. Bring biscuits." Harry laughed out loud, alone in Grimmauld Place, and the sound bounced off the old walls and came back to him, softer, warmer, like the house itself was learning a new language. He folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the carved pumpkin, and sat by the fire. Outside, London rain tapped at the windows. Inside, pumpkin lights glowed, steady and kind. And Harry, who had once thought he'd never feel safe anywhere, let his shoulders drop, let his breath slow, and let himself believe, just for tonight, that home wasn't a place you were born into. It was a place you were welcomed into. It was a place you chose, again and again. And he had, the weekend before Christmas. And the quiet things that matter, Harry, arrived at the Burrow the next weekend with a tin of biscuits under his arm, and the faint feeling that he was stepping into a storm. Not the dangerous kind, the Weasley kind, the kind made of flower dust and laughter, and Molly Weasley's voice calling instructions, like she was conducting an orchestra that refused to read music. He came through the flue and landed, for once, on his feet. Ron was already waiting, leaning against the mantel with a grin that suggested he'd been there for at least 10 minutes purely to make fun of Harry if he fell over. "Look at you," Ron said. "All grown up." Not even kissing the rug. "Give it time," Harry replied, brushing ash off his sleeves. Hermione stepped out behind him, neat as always, her beaded bag swinging lightly from her wrist. Ginny followed last, quick and smooth, like she'd been born to travel through green flame. She didn't even blink, just handed Ron a small parcel without slowing down. "Put that somewhere safe," she said. "It's Mum's cinnamon sticks. If you lose them, she'll actually murder you." Ron held the parcel like it was a live bomb. "Why am I in charge of the murder sticks?" "Because you were closest," Ginny said, and then she smiled at Harry. "You made it." Harry didn't correct her by saying he always made it. Instead, he just nodded and let the warmth of being expected settle in his chest. The Burrow looked like it was in the middle of becoming Christmas, not fully there yet, but halfway between autumn and winter magic. There were still a few dried leaves stuck in the corners of the windowsill, but now there were also strings of holly hanging from the ceiling, and a half-built wreath on the table that kept trying to rearrange itself into what it clearly believed was a better design. Molly appeared from the kitchen like she'd been summoned by the sound of someone arriving. Her apron had changed from pumpkins to dancing candy canes, which marched in little lines across the fabric and occasionally stopped to bow at each other. "Harry, Hermione, Ginny, Ron," she said in one breath, and pulled them into a sequence of hugs that felt like a checklist, except the checklist was made of love. "Good. You're all here. Right. Shoes off, please, and wash your hands. And Ron, don't you dare put those biscuits anywhere near the cat." "We don't have a cat," Ron said automatically. "We do when Crookshanks visits," Molly replied, and pointed a wooden spoon at him. "And you know perfectly well he thinks everything belongs to him." Hermione looked faintly offended on behalf of Crookshanks, but she didn't argue. Arthur's voice floated in from the sitting room. "Molly, did you know Muggles have special lights for Christmas? Little ones, like fairy lights, but without fairies. They plug them into the wall." Molly's answering sigh was so practiced it sounded affectionate. "Arthur, dear, please don't plug anything into the wall unless you want to spend Christmas in St. Mungo's." "It's perfectly safe," Arthur called back. "I've tested it." Ron muttered. He always says that right before something explodes. Ginny leaned toward Harry. "Dad has been trying to charm a set of Muggle Christmas lights to spell out Merry Christmas in midair." Harry blinked. "Can he do that?" Ginny's expression turned thoughtful. "He can do a lot of things. Whether he should is another question." In the kitchen, the air smelled like nutmeg and oranges, and something rich baking in the oven. Bowls were everywhere. Not just bowls, but the idea of bowls. Flour hovered in faint clouds that drifted and settled like soft snow. A spoon stirred itself in a pot on the stove, slow and steady, like it was proud of its job. Molly pushed Hermione gently toward the table. "I need you on pastry," she said. "You're precise. You'll be good for it." Hermione looked startled, like she'd just been offered a medal. "I'd love to." Molly pointed at Ginny next. "You're on decorations. Take Ron with you, and go fetch the box from the attic, and don't let the ghoul bite you." "It doesn't bite," Ron complained. "It would if it could," Ginny said cheerfully, and dragged him towards the stairs. Molly turned to Harry. and for a second her expression softened into something quieter. "You," she said. "Not as an order this time. You can help Arthur with the tree." Harry smiled. "I can do that." The tree, it turned out, was not in the garden, as Harry had expected. It was in the shed, leaning against a stack of broom handles like it was waiting for its cue. Arthur had already begun explaining to it why being a Christmas tree was an honorable responsibility. "It's a fine specimen," Arthur said, patting it. "I wanted one that would hold enchanted ornaments properly. Some trees get offended." "Offended," Harry repeated. Arthur nodded seriously. "You'd be surprised what plants take personally. Now, we need to get it into the sitting room without snapping the branches, and Molly insists we do it the proper way, which means no blasting spells." Harry grabbed the trunk, and Arthur did the same, and between them they hauled the tree across the garden path and into the house. It scraped against the doorway. Arthur apologized to it like it was a person. "Sorry," he murmured. "It's a tight fit. You're very broad." Harry was laughing by the time they got it upright in the corner of the sitting room. The burrow's ceiling wasn't high enough for a tall tree, so the top bent slightly, like it was bowing to fit. Arthur stepped back, hands on hips. "Perfect," he declared. The sitting room already had the first hints of Christmas magic. A garland of silver tinsel draped itself across the mantel, glittering softly even without light. A pile of wrapped parcels sat under a side table, not presents yet, just supplies, because Molly had a way of wrapping even ordinary things, if she thought it made the house feel more festive. A small, knitted snowman sat on the arm of a chair, its button eyes following Harry as he moved. "That's new," Harry said, nodding at it. Arthur smiled. "Molly made it. Says every Christmas needs at least one thing that looks slightly haunted. Keeps it interesting." Before Harry could ask what that meant, Fred and George barreled into the room carrying a crate that rattled ominously. They were wearing matching red jumpers with a gold W on the front, and both looked far too pleased with themselves. "Christmas has arrived," Fred announced. "Whether anyone wanted it or not," George added. Arthur brightened like he'd been waiting for them. "Ah, perfect timing. Boys, you can help with the lights." Molly's voice snapped from the kitchen. "Arthur, no experimental muggle lights." Fred leaned toward Harry, speaking in a low voice that was somehow still loud. "He's been trying to convince Mum that muggle lights are harmless." George nodded sympathetically. "Mum hears the word muggle and assumes fire." "Reasonable," Harry said. Fred opened the crate, just enough for Harry to see what was inside. It was full of ornaments, but not normal ornaments. Some of them moved. Some of them made small noises. One of them appeared to be a tiny dragon that blinked and yawned like it had just woken up. "Prototype decorations?" Fred said proudly. "Seasonal," George clarified quickly. "Festive, not dangerous." Harry peered closer. "That one's breathing smoke." "It's festive smoke," Fred said. Arthur leaned in, delighted. "Oh, very clever. Is that a combustion charm?" "It's a controlled charm," George said, which sounded like the same thing with better manners. Molly appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, and her eyes narrowed with the speed of a hawk spotting prey. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Decorating," Fred and George said together, and managed expressions of innocence that only made them look guiltier. Molly looked at the crate. "If I see a single ornament that explodes, sings rude songs, or tries to bite your sister, it goes straight into the bin." Ron's voice floated down the stairs. "We don't have a bin big enough." "We'll find one," Molly called back, and then she turned her glare on the twins. "I mean it. Yes, Mum, they chorused, and waited until she vanished back into the kitchen before grinning at each other. She loves us, Fred whispered. She threatens us because she cares, George agreed. The day settled into a rhythm that felt like the Burrow's natural state, constant motion with comfort built into it. Hermione rolled pastry with a concentration that made it look like serious academic work. Flour ended up on her cheek, and Molly brushed it away with fond impatience. Ginny and Ron came down from the attic carrying a box of decorations that tried to slide out of Ron's hands, as if it didn't respect him. "Why do I always get the difficult box?" Ron complained. Ginny smirked. Because it senses weakness. Arthur began hanging garlands. He hummed while he did it, tuneless but happy. At one point he stopped and held up a strand of Muggle lights like it was a rare treasure. "See," he said to Harry. "No magic at all, but still beautiful. Muggles make light without wands." Harry watched the tiny bulbs glow and felt something odd. Not sadness. Not quite. Just a quiet recognition that the world was wider than he'd ever had time to notice, when everything was life and death. "They'd like you," Arthur added suddenly. "My mum and dad, I mean. They'd think you were brilliant." Harry swallowed. "Thanks." Arthur seemed to understand. That was all Harry could manage. He patted Harry's shoulder, then went back to the garland like he hadn't said anything heavy at all. By afternoon, snow began to fall. Not thick, dramatic snow, just small flakes that drifted lazily, catching in the hedges and melting on the window glass. The garden looked softer. The world outside the burrow seemed quieter, as if even the air was trying to be gentle. Molly called everyone to the table for lunch. It wasn't a feast, not like Halloween had been, but it was still more food than seemed possible for a weekend. Soup that warmed your throat. Bread that replenished itself if you weren't watching. A plate of mince pies that Molly slapped Ron's hand away from every time he reached for a second. "Dinner is later," she warned. "It's always later," Ron muttered, but he obeyed. After lunch, Hermione and Molly vanished into the kitchen for what Molly called serious cooking, which sounded like a military operation. Ginny dragged Harry outside to help hang enchanted icicles along the porch. Fred and George claimed they were tidying and disappeared upstairs, which meant they were definitely not tidying. Harry stood on a small stool, reaching up to hook a string of icicles along the wooden beam. The icicles weren't cold. Not really. They were glassy and shimmering, and when you touched them, they chimed softly like tiny bells. Ginny worked beside him with easy confidence. Ginny worked beside him with easy confidence. She moved like someone who'd grown up doing this every year, which she had. She tied the charm knots quickly, checking each one with a small flick of her wand. "You look less tense," she said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Harry paused. "Do I?" Ginny shrugged. "Yeah. At Halloween, you were happy, but it was like you were waiting for it to stop. Now you look like you believe it can keep going." Harry stared at the icicles, pretending to focus. "Maybe I do." Ginny didn't push. She never did. She just nodded and kept tying knots, letting the quiet exist between them the way it was meant to. When they finished, Ginny hopped off the porch and looked up at their work. The icicles hung in neat lines, catching the pale winter light and scattering it into small sparkles. "Perfect," she said. Harry stepped down carefully. "Molly's going to say one of them is crooked." Ginny grinned. "She will. And then she'll fix it with a charm and pretend she didn't." They went back inside, and the house hit Harry with warmth like a wave. The fire was crackling. The smell of baking had become stronger. The tree was now half decorated, ornaments hovering around it like they were waiting for permission to attach themselves. Hermione emerged from the kitchen with flushed cheeks and her sleeves rolled up. "Harry," she said briskly, "I need you to taste something." Harry blinked. "Taste what?" Hermione held out a spoon like a wand. "The filling for the pudding. Molly says it needs more brandy, but I think it's perfectly balanced and Ron is useless because he'd eat anything and claim it was perfect." Ron, lounging on the sofa, raised a hand. "I heard that." "You were meant to," Hermione replied, and pushed the spoon at Harry. Harry tasted it. It was rich and warm, sweet with spice, and there was a sharp edge that made his eyes water slightly. "It's good," he said honestly. "Maybe a tiny bit more brandy." Hermione's face lit up with victory. "Thank you." A reasonable opinion. Molly appeared behind her like a looming judge. "I told you," she said, satisfied. "Harry knows."
He's got good taste, Hermione muttered. Or he's terrified of you.
Molly ignored that completely and turned to Arthur. "Arthur, the post should arrive soon. Keep an eye out. There should be a letter from Percy." The room shifted. Not into silence exactly, but into something tighter, like everyone had taken a breath and wasn't sure when to let it out. Ron's expression changed first, his mouth flattening. Ginny's eyes flicked away. Fred and George, who had been pretending to argue about ornament placement, went very still. Harry didn't say anything. He remembered Percy's stiff posture, the way he'd looked at his family like they were a problem to be solved. He remembered the pain that had hung around the Weasleys whenever Percy's name came up. Molly, though, held herself steady. "He wrote last week," she said, voice brisk. "Said he might come by. Just for a bit. Duh." Ron snorted. "Convenient." "Ronald," Molly said sharply. "I'm just saying," Ron muttered, but he didn't argue further. Arthur cleared his throat softly. "People make mistakes," he said. "Careful. And sometimes they take a long time to admit them." Fred's voice was light, but there was something thin underneath it. Percy always did like taking a long time. George nodded. "Makes him feel important." Molly's eyes flashed. "Enough," she said. "Whatever happens, we will be civil." Everyone obeyed, because when Molly said something in that tone, you didn't fight it. But the tension stayed, tucked into the corners, like dust you couldn't quite sweep away. The post arrived an hour later, not by Owl, but by Percy himself. Harry heard the knock first, sharp and polite. Molly froze for a fraction of a second, then wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. The rest of them ended up in the sitting room, hovering like people who didn't know where to put their bodies. Arthur stood as if that mattered. Ron stayed sitting, arms crossed. Ginny perched on the edge of the sofa like she might bolt. Fred and George leaned against the wall, identical in their watchfulness, their humor set aside. The door opened. Percy stepped in, and for a moment Harry didn't recognize him. Not because Percy looked wildly different, but because he looked tired. Properly tired. His hair was still neat, his robe still pressed, but there were lines at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes looked like they'd been carrying too much for too long. "Mum," Percy said, voice quiet. Molly stood in the doorway with her hand on the doorframe as though she needed something solid. "Percy," she replied. He swallowed, glanced past her at the room full of faces, and for the first time in years, he looked nervous. "I got your letter," Molly said, though of course she had. "Come in. It's cold out there." Percy stepped into the warmth, and the Burrow seemed to hesitate around him, like even the house remembered old arguments. Ron didn't move. Fred and George didn't speak. Ginny watched Percy like she was trying to decide if he was real. Arthur stepped forward first, because Arthur always did. "Hello, son," Arthur said gently. Percy's throat bobbed. "Hello, Dad." Then Molly crossed the space between them and hugged Percy. It wasn't a neat hug. It wasn't polite. It was fierce and trembling, and full of everything she hadn't said for years. Percy went stiff at first, then his shoulders dropped, and he hugged her back like he'd been starving. "Oh, Percy," Molly whispered, and Harry heard something break in her voice. "Oh, my boy." Percy's eyes were shiny when she let him go. He looked around again. "I don't expect," he began, then stopped, because he didn't know how to finish the sentence. Ron finally stood. His face was hard, but his eyes were red around the edges. "Why now?" Ron demanded, voice rough. Percy flinched. "Because I should have come sooner," he said honestly. "Because I was wrong." Fred gave a short laugh that held no humor. "That's a big word for you, Perce." George added quietly, "Does it hurt to say it?" Percy's mouth tightened. "Yes," he said, "it does." Silence stretched thick as treacle. Ginny stood slowly. "You missed a lot," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Percy nodded, looking ashamed. "I know." He glanced at Harry then, and his face changed again, awkwardness mixing with something like regret. "Harry," he said. Sorry for the things I said, the way I behaved." Harry didn't know what to do with that. He hadn't expected Percy to apologize to him. Percy had always been the Weasley who treated Harry like an inconvenient headline. "It's all right," Harry said carefully. Because it wasn't all right, not really. But this moment wasn't about him. "I'm glad you're here." Percy looked relieved, like he'd been holding his breath. Arthur gestured toward the sofa. "Sit," he said gentle. "Have some tea. Your mum's been cooking all day. You're going to eat whether you want to or not." Percy almost smiled. "Yes, Dad." They sat, stiffly at first. Molly brought tea, like it was an offering of peace. Percy held his cup too carefully, as though he was afraid to spill it and ruin the chance he'd been given. He spoke slowly, choosing his words like he always had. But now there was something raw underneath the carefulness. "The ministry," Percy began, then stopped. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "I thought loyalty meant obedience. I thought you were all being reckless." Ron let out a harsh sound. "We were being alive." Percy flinched again. "Yes," he said quietly. "And I was being proud. I was terrified, and I turned it into judgment. I convinced myself that if I followed the rules hard enough, nothing bad would happen." Fred's voice was soft now, which was somehow worse than if he'd been loud. "And when bad things happened anyway." Percy looked at his hands. Then I didn't know how to face what I'd done. George watched him for a long moment. "So you stayed away?" Percy nodded. "Yes." Molly reached over and squeezed Percy's hand. "You're here now," she said, voice trembling but steady. "That's what matters." Ron looked like he wanted to argue, then seemed to realize he didn't have the energy for it. He dropped back into his seat, rubbing a hand over his face like he was wiping away years. Ginny leaned into Harry slightly, not quite touching, but close enough that he felt the warmth of her shoulder. Harry didn't move away. He stayed, because this was what staying looked like. Percy didn't stay long. He seemed to know he didn't have the right to. He drank his tea, ate 2 mince pies, because Molly forced them into his hands, and then stood awkwardly near the door, as if he didn't know whether he was allowed to linger. "I'll go," he said quietly. I wanted to come." To say it. To try. Molly hugged him again. Arthur hugged him too, gentle and firm. Ginny hugged him, quick and slightly awkward. Ron hesitated, then, with a look like it cost him something, stepped forward and clapped Percy on the shoulder. "Don't be a stranger," Ron said, voice gruff. Percy's face tightened. "I won't," he promised. Fred and George didn't hug him. They just stood there, watching. Percy looked at them, helpless. "I'm sorry," he said again, quieter. "I don't know what else to say." Fred stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged slightly. "Start with showing up," he said. George nodded. "And don't expect it to be easy." Percy swallowed. "I don't." Then he left, and the door closed, and the Burrow let out a breath like it had been holding it the whole time. Molly stood with her hand on the doorknob, staring at the wood, as if she could still feel Percy's presence through it. Arthur came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. "He came," Arthur said softly. Molly nodded, blinking hard. "He came," she repeated, like she needed to say it, to make it real. Ron sat heavily, looking exhausted. Ginny rubbed her arms like she was cold, even though the room was warm. Fred and George exchanged one of their looks, but this one wasn't mischief. It was something quieter, something uncertain. Hermione broke the silence gently. "That was brave," she said, voice soft. Ron snorted. "It was late." Hermione nodded. "Yes," she agreed. But it was still brave. No one argued with that, because it was true, and because they didn't have the strength to deny it. Molly wiped her face quickly and squared her shoulders. "Right," she said briskly, because that was what she did when feelings threatened to overwhelm her. "Enough sitting around. We've got dinner to finish, and the tree still needs ornaments. And I refuse to let Percy's visit ruin the weekend. Christmas is coming whether we're ready or not." Fred brightened slightly. "That's the spirit," George added. "Relentless, festive, marching toward destiny." Molly pointed her spoon at them. "Don't you start." They decorated the tree together after that, because it was easier to do something with your hands than to sit with all the things you felt. Ornaments floated into place. Some were old, clearly handmade, slightly lopsided. Some were new, glittering. One of them, a small glass bauble shaped like a stag, drifted to Harry's side of the tree and hovered there as if it had chosen him. Molly pretended not to notice. Hermione did notice, and her smile was gentle. Arthur insisted on putting the Muggle lights on the tree too, and after much arguing, Molly allowed it under strict conditions, including Arthur promising not to charm them. "They're just lights," Arthur said, delighted as he plugged them into a battery pack he'd somehow acquired. "They're a risk," Molly muttered, but when they lit up, warm and soft, she looked pleased despite herself. Dinner was hearty and loud, the way Weasley dinners always were. Fred and George told stories about customers at the shop. Ron complained about ministry paperwork, even though he didn't work there. Ginny teased him until he laughed. Hermione talked about some new initiative she was trying to push through, and Arthur listened with fascination. asking earnest questions that made Hermione's eyes shine. Harry sat among them, eating, laughing, when it felt right, quiet when he needed to be. The earlier tension still existed, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened into something that could be carried. Percy's visit hadn't fixed everything. Nothing fixed everything that quickly, but it had created a crack in the wall, a place where light could get in. Later, when the house was quieter and the fire was low, Harry found himself in the kitchen with Molly, helping her wash dishes. The plates scrubbed themselves, but Molly liked the ritual of it anyway. Her hands moved through the warm water, as if the motion helped her think. "He looked so thin," Molly said suddenly, voice quiet. Harry didn't pretend not to know who she meant. "He did," Harry agreed. Molly sighed. "I used to imagine this moment," she admitted. "Him coming back. Ah." And in my imagining, I was always furious. I was always ready to shout. I had speeches prepared. "And then?" Harry asked gently. Molly's eyes went bright again. "And then he walked in, and he looked like my boy again. And I just wanted to hold him so tight he couldn't leave." Harry swallowed. He understood that kind of love. The kind that didn't keep score the way anger did. The kind that didn't erase the hurt, but still opened the door. "You're a good mum," Harry said quietly. Molly snorted, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm a stubborn mum," she corrected. "There's a difference." Harry smiled. "Stubborn helps." Molly looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and tapped his cheek lightly, like she was checking he was real. "You're doing all right, aren't you?" she asked softly. "Really doing all right?" Harry could have lied. He could have said yes easily. But the Burrow had a way of making honesty feel safe. "I'm getting there," he said. Molly nodded, like that was enough. "Good," she said firmly. "That's all I ask, one step at a time." That night, Harry lay in Ron's room again, listening to the Burrow settle. Ron was already asleep, snoring softly. The ghoul banged once in the attic and then went quiet. The wind pressed against the windows, carrying the faint sound of winter. Harry stared at the ceiling and thought about Percy's face when he'd stepped into the house. The fear in it, the hope, the shame, the courage. Harry thought about how people changed. Slowly, painfully, sometimes too late. But still, he thought about Christmas coming, about Molly's relentless planning, about Arthur's dangerous fascination with Muggle lights, about Hermione's lists, about Ginny's steady presence, about Ron's rough loyalty, about Fred and George's humor that always covered something deeper. And he thought again about home. Home wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't always easy. It was arguments and forgiveness and awkward silences and laughter that returned when you didn't expect it. Home was a door that opened even after years. Harry closed his eyes and let the warmth of that thought settle in him. Outside, snow kept falling, quiet and patient, covering the garden in a soft white layer. Inside, the Burrow glowed with Christmas lights and firelight and the stubborn, enduring magic of a family that kept choosing each other, again and again. Christmas Day, the loud kind of healing. Christmas morning at the Burrow didn't arrive quietly. It arrived like a marching band. Harry woke to the smell of cinnamon and roasting meat drifting up the stairs, and the unmistakable sound of Molly Weasley already giving instructions to someone who was definitely not awake enough to follow them. "Ronald, if you fall back asleep, I will personally tip that entire mattress over." Ron responded with a noise that could have meant anything from "yes, mum" to "I am literally a corpse," and then rolled over. Harry sat up, rubbing his face, blinking at the pale winter light coming through the window. Outside, snow still clung to the branches in the orchard like icing. The sky was bright and clean, the kind of cold morning that made everything feel sharper. He glanced at the scarf Molly had knitted him, folded neatly at the end of the camp bed. He touched it lightly, then stood up and began pulling on clothes. Ron finally dragged himself upright with dramatic suffering. "If I die today," he muttered, "tell my gravestone I was too young, too handsome, and too hungry." "You're definitely hungry," Harry said. "Starving," Ron confirmed. "I can smell Mum's cooking, and I can feel it calling to me like a siren. I will be devoured by gravy." They shuffled downstairs, and the Burrow was already in full Christmas mode. The sitting room lights were on. The tree shimmered with its blinking muggle lights and enchanted baubles. Somewhere in the kitchen, pans clattered like they were arguing with each other. The house itself felt awake, buzzing with warmth. Hermione was already downstairs, of course, sitting at the table in the kitchen with a mug of tea and an open book. She looked up as Harry and Ron entered, her eyes bright. "Morning," she said cheerfully. "Molly, let me taste the stuffing." "It's incredible." Ron stared at her. "It's Christmas. Why are you reading?" Hermione's eyebrows lifted.
It's Christmas. Why aren't you reading? Ron looked at Harry as if begging for support.
Harry shrugged. "She's unstoppable." Ginny came in behind them, hair slightly wild, wearing her green jumper again, and looking like she'd already done something productive. "Mum sent me to find Fred and George," she said, sounding both amused and resigned. "She thinks they're up to something." Ron snorted. "They're always up to something." "They are, I know," Ginny said. "But she thinks it's something bigger than usual because she found a note that said, Phase 2, deploy at 11:47. Hermione's head snapped up. "Deploy?" Ginny nodded. "That's what I said." Before Hermione could launch into a lecture about the meaning of ominous words in the Weasley household, Percy appeared in the doorway. Harry felt the room shift again, the way it had last night when Percy arrived. Not as sharp this time, but noticeable. Like a draft. Percy looked like he hadn't slept much. His hair was slightly messy, and his jumper, Molly's jumper, was on, though he wore it like he wasn't sure it belonged to him. He paused, eyes flicking over everyone, then cleared his throat. "Good morning," he said carefully. Hermione smiled immediately. "Merry Christmas, Percy." Percy's shoulders loosened a fraction. "Merry Christmas," he replied. Ron didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "Merry Christmas," Ron said at last, voice flat, like he was handing Percy a fragile object and didn't want to drop it. Percy's eyes looked suspiciously bright again. "Yes," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas." Ginny stepped forward and shoved a plate into Percy's hands. "Eat," she ordered. "If you don't eat, Mum will start watching you like a hawk, and then none of us will survive." Percy blinked at the plate. Toast and jam, a small mercy. He gave Ginny a faint, grateful smile and sat down. Arthur breezed in with a ridiculous Santa hat on his head. Red felt, white trim, the works. It looked slightly singed, as if it had survived an accident. "Christmas," Arthur announced, beaming. "Merry Christmas, everyone," Molly's voice shouted from the stove area. "Arthur, stop shouting. The pudding can hear you." Arthur lowered his voice to a stage whisper. "The pudding has feelings." "It's under a charm," Molly snapped, but there was laughter in her tone. "And if you distract me, it'll collapse, and then you'll all be eating plain custard, and none of you want that." Ron looked genuinely alarmed. "I want the pudding to succeed." "Then stop breathing in my direction," Molly said briskly, and Ron promptly backed away, as if she'd waved a wand at him. Breakfast was chaotic in the way Burrow meals always were. Plates appeared, vanished, refilled. Arthur tried to explain the origins of Muggle Christmas crackers to Percy, and Percy listened politely while looking like he was trying not to fall into familiar ministry posture. Hermione asked questions about Molly's charm work on the pudding. Ginny stole bacon directly from Ron's plate. Ron complained. Harry laughed. The house held them all in its warm, noisy grip. Then Molly clapped her hands. "Right," she declared. "Presents first, before anyone gets too full, or before Fred and George decide to explode something festive. Sitting room. Now." They piled into the sitting room, and the tree sat in the corner, like a glowing, slightly smug guardian. Presents were stacked beneath it in a messy mountain. Tags and ribbon everywhere. The air smelled like pine and firewood and sugar. Arthur sat down with his Santa hat still on. Molly sat on her chair with a look of fierce satisfaction, as if she'd personally wrestled Christmas into submission. Hermione perched on the rug. Ginny sat on the arm of Ron's sofa, like she was ready to jump up at any moment. Fred and George finally appeared, strolling in with identical, innocent expressions and hands suspiciously empty. Molly narrowed her eyes at them. "Where have you been?" "Spreading cheer," Fred said smoothly. "Organizing joy," George added. "Plotting nonsense," Ginny muttered. Fred placed a hand on his chest. "We're offended." George nodded solemnly, deeply. Molly pointed at them with a warning finger. "If you ruin my sitting room—" "We would never," they said together, far too quickly. Molly's eyes narrowed further, but then she huffed and started handing out gifts like a woman determined to keep moving forward. Gifts at the Burrow weren't quiet affairs. There was laughter and teasing and the constant rustle of paper. Hermione unwrapped a new set of quills that adjusted ink flow automatically and looked absurdly pleased. Ginny got a book about advanced Quidditch tactics and immediately started flipping through it like she might memorize it before lunch. Ron got a new cannon's scarf and reacted like he'd been given treasure, even as he pretended to grumble. Arthur opened something from Molly and looked genuinely delighted. A new set of tools for tinkering, each enchanted with safety warnings that physically buzzed if he tried to do something stupid.
"Brilliant," Arthur said, grinning. "Look, it vibrates if I try to connect the wrong wire."
"That's the point," Molly said firmly. Percy opened his present slowly, carefully. He received socks from Molly, obviously, a book from Hermione, and something from Arthur that looked like a tiny framed photograph of the family. Percy stared at the photograph for a long moment. The figures moved gently, waving, smiling. Even Percy's own tiny image looked awkward but present. His throat bobbed. "Thank you," he said quietly. Molly sniffed loudly, pretending she hadn't. Fred and George unwrapped their gifts with exaggerated flair, reacting loudly to everything, making everyone laugh even when the jokes were terrible. They received jumpers, sweets, and several very pointed, "do not cause chaos" notes from Molly that they pretended to take seriously. Then Harry opened his gifts. There were practical ones, new gloves, a book from Hermione about advanced protective charms, a set of Quidditch socks from Ron that had moving little smidges on them, something from Ginny, an old photo of them all at the Burrow, charmed so it gently warmed your hand when you held it. And then Molly gave him one last parcel. It was larger than the scarf, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Molly held it out with both hands, face strangely careful. "This one," she said softly, "is from all of us." Harry's hands suddenly felt clumsy. He took it slowly, staring at the tag with his name on it. He unwrapped it. Inside was a photo album. Not a fancy one. Leather-bound, warm brown, sturdy. The kind that would last. Harry opened it cautiously. The first page held a photograph of the Burrow in winter. Snow on the roof, smoke curling from the chimney. The picture moved gently, the chimney smoke drifting. On the next page, a photo of Harry at the Burrow in the summer, younger, laughing, his hair a mess. Molly in the background wiping her hands on her apron. Then another. Harry and Ron on the sofa, grinning, covered in what looked like icing, likely from some disaster in the kitchen. Then one of Hermione reading at the table, Ron throwing something at her head, Ginny laughing. There were photos from years of visits, small moments Harry barely remembered until he saw them and felt them click back into place. A photo of Arthur teaching Harry how to fix something in the shed. A picture of Harry in the garden, looking peaceful. A photo of the whole family at a Christmas table, arms thrown around each other. Harry's throat tightened hard. He turned a page and found one that made his breath catch. A photo of Molly hugging him, his face pressed into her shoulder, Molly's eyes fierce and protective. Harry blinked. Rapidly. "We," Molly began, then stopped and cleared her throat. "We thought you should have them. Memories. You deserve to keep them." Harry looked up, and every face was watching him. Ron looked suddenly serious. Hermione's eyes were wet. Ginny's mouth wobbled like she was trying not to cry. Arthur smiled gently. Even Fred and George looked quieter. Harry's voice came out rough. This is too soppy," Fred offered, trying to lighten it, but his voice was softer than usual. "Very soppy," George added. "Perfectly soppy," Ginny snapped, voice thick. Harry swallowed. "It's perfect," he managed. Molly stood abruptly and pulled him into a hug so fierce it was almost painful, like she could physically hold him together. "All right," she said into his hair, voice shaking. "All right. That's enough. Don't cry on me. I've got dinner to serve, and if I start crying, the gravy will go wrong." Harry laughed a little, half broken, half real, and held on for a second longer than he usually would. Then, as if the universe had decided they'd had enough emotion for one morning, there was a sudden loud pop. Everyone froze. A thin stream of glittery smoke rose from behind the tree. Molly's head snapped around slowly, eyes narrowing into a look of pure maternal vengeance. Fred. Fred held up his hands immediately. "Not me." "George," Molly said, voice dangerously calm. George looked offended. "Also not me." Another pop. This time, a small, enchanted banner unfurled above the fireplace. It read, "Happy Christmas, Phase 2. Commencing Casmer." Hermione's eyes widened. "Oh, no," Ron groaned. "Ron." "I hate those words." Before Molly could even stand up, the Burrow itself responded. The portraits on the walls cleared their throats in unison, then began singing. Not carols, a ridiculous, overly dramatic Christmas opera. Aunt Muriel's portrait started it, voice booming and theatrical. "On this most holy morning we present Dr. Witt." Molly's mouth opened, was silent. Boys, Fred and George, looked delighted. "We couldn't help it," Fred said, already grinning. "We had to," George added. Christmas demanded innovation. The enchanted opera continued. Portraits sang in sequence, passing the melody like a relay. One portrait sobbed dramatically about mistletoe. Another lamented the tragedy of burnt mince pies. A stern wizard portrait declared that the true meaning of Christmas was order and proper documentation. which made Percy flinch as if attacked. Ron buried his face in his hands. "This is my nightmare." Ginny laughed so hard she nearly fell off the arm of the sofa. Hermione stood up, wand out, scanning the magic. "This is incredibly complex," she muttered, sounding impressed despite herself. "They've synchronized the portraits again, but with a different spell lattice." Molly glared at Fred and George. "How long?" "Only until lunch," Fred promised quickly. "Or until you find the counter-charm," George added. Molly pointed her wand at them, eyes blazing. "You will find it." Fred and George made identical innocent faces. "Of course, Mum." The opera reached a crescendo where a portrait of an elderly witch dramatically sang about wrapping paper scarcity, and then, mercifully, it began to fade. The last line came from Aunt Muriel, "Merry Christmas, you ungrateful lot." And then she fell silent mid-insult, frozen in dramatic pose. The room exploded into laughter. Relieved, helpless laughter. Molly huffed, but even she was smiling now, shaking her head like she couldn't win. "Honestly," she muttered, standing up, "I make one emotional moment, and you too decide to unleash a portrait choir." Fred grinned. "We're artists." George nodded. "We felt the vibe shifting too sentimental." "It was sentimental," Ginny said firmly. "And that's fine." Ron groaned. "I feel like I'm living in a circus." Arthur patted Ron's shoulder. "A festive circus." The morning rolled into early afternoon in a blur of warmth. They played a few games. Ginny bullied everyone into a quick snowball fight outside, which turned into Fred and George using magic to create snowballs that screamed when they hit you. Hermione threatened them with hexes and then got hit in the back by a screaming snowball and let out a noise that sounded like pure betrayal. Percy stayed mostly on the edges at first, watching, uncertain. But as the snowball fight became less organized and more ridiculous, Percy found himself laughing when George slipped on ice and landed in a snowdrift. Fred pointed dramatically. "See? Even Percy approves."
Percy's face turned red.
I did not. He started, but then he sighed. "Yes, all right, I did." Ron watched Percy carefully. There were moments where Ron looked like he wanted to say something sharp, something that had been waiting for years. But then Ginny would shout, or Fred would launch another screaming snowball, and the sharp words didn't come out. They stayed stuck, not gone, but held back. By the time they came inside, cheeks pink from cold, Molly was already roaring orders. "Shoes off, gloves by the fire. Do not track snow into my kitchen." Ron attempted to slink past with snow in his hair. Molly caught him with one look. Ron froze. "Yes, Mum." "Dry your hair," Molly ordered. Ron sighed like a man condemned. "Yes, Mum." The Christmas feast began at 3. Molly extended the table with a flick of her wand, the wood stretching like it had always meant to hold them. Plates appeared. Cutlery chimed. The room filled with the scent of roast turkey, gravy, stuffing, roasted potatoes, vegetables glazed with something sweet, and a pudding that glowed faintly under its charm like it was proud to exist. They ate like they hadn't eaten in weeks, which was, in Ron's case, probably true in spirit. Conversation flowed and jumped around. Arthur told a story about trying to buy a Muggle Christmas tree decoration and getting trapped in a conversation with a man who thought Arthur was a very committed historical reenactor. Fred and George offered commentary like a chorus. Ginny argued with Ron about Quidditch teams. Hermione tried to get Molly to explain the pudding charm again. Molly refused until after dinner because no one studies on Christmas, Hermione, honestly. Percy sat between Arthur and Ginny, and for the first time all day, he looked less like a visitor and more like someone who belonged at the table. He ate steadily, quiet but present. At one point, Percy cleared his throat. The room didn't go silent, not at first, but people began to notice. Ron's fork paused. Ginny looked up. Hermione's attention sharpened instantly. Fred and George went still in the way. They only did when something real was about to happen. Percy's hands tightened around his fork. He stared at his plate, then looked up at Molly. "Mum," he said, voice unsteady. Molly's face softened immediately. "Yes, love?" Percy swallowed hard. He stopped, started again. "I'm sorry." The room became quiet now. Not awkward quiet, but attentive. The kind of quiet that means everyone is listening. Percy's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I chose wrong. I'm sorry I believed people who didn't deserve it. I'm sorry I wasn't." His voice cracked. "I wasn't a good son." Molly's eyes filled instantly. Her mouth trembled, and she reached across the table like she could pull him back by force. "Oh, Percy," she whispered. Percy blinked hard. "I don't expect you to just forgive me," he said quickly, looking toward Ron, then toward Fred and George. I know what I did. I know what I said. And I can't take it back. But I want to be here, if you'll let me." Ron stared at Percy, jaw tight. Fred and George watched, expressions unreadable. Ginny's eyes shone. Hermione looked like she was holding her breath. Arthur reached out and placed his hand over Percy's. "We've always wanted you here," Arthur said quietly. Molly stood so fast her chair scraped. She moved around the table and hugged Percy with fierce, shaking arms. "You stupid boy," she whispered into his hair. "You stupid, stubborn boy. Of course we want you here." Percy's shoulders shook as he clung to her, and for a moment he looked like a child again, not a ministry man, not a mistake, just a son. Ron's throat worked. He looked away quickly, blinking hard. Fred and George didn't move. They didn't joke. They watched, and something in their faces shifted. Still guarded, still hurt, but less sharp. Molly pulled back, wiping her eyes furiously. "Right," she said briskly, voice thick. "Right. Eat your dinner before it goes cold." Percy gave a shaky laugh, wiping his face. "Yes, Mum." Sometimes bigger, a brother who pointed at once at these times of days and brought another, heavier, understood. For now, a few chances happened. Later, when pudding was served, dark, rich, steaming, with sauce poured over it, Ron nudged Harry's knee under the table. Harry glanced at him. Ron's eyes were red, but his face was set. "I'm still angry," Ron murmured, voice low. Harry nodded. "Yeah." Ron swallowed. "But maybe I can be angry and still, Still have him here?" Harry asked quietly. Ron's mouth tightened. Harry looked across the table. Percy was laughing at something Arthur had said, wiping his eyes again like he was still overwhelmed. He looked like he didn't quite believe this was real. Harry's chest ached in a strange, warm way. "I think you can," Harry said. Ron nodded once, like that was enough for now. After the feast, the sitting room turned into a sprawl of tired bodies and contentment. Someone put on music. Molly brought out tea. Fred and George produced Christmas crackers that actually behaved for once, though Harry suspected that was only because Hermione had threatened to personally hex them if they caused another Phase 2 event. They pulled crackers, laughed at jokes, put on paper crowns. Arthur insisted everyone wear their crowns properly. Ginny wore hers at a jaunty angle. Hermione tried to straighten hers precisely. Ron's fell into his eyes. Percy sat in an armchair with a crown slightly crumpled on his head, looking vaguely bewildered. Fred and George watched him like they were waiting for something. Eventually, Fred stood up and walked over, holding a cracker. Percy stiffened. Fred held it out. Here, Percy stared at it like it was a trap. "What is this?" "A cracker," George said from the sofa, voice casual. Percy's eyes flicked to George. "I know what a cracker is." "I mean..." Fred sighed dramatically. "Percy, if we wanted to trap you, we'd do it properly." George nodded. "We'd use glitter." Ginny snorted into her tea. Percy hesitated, then reached out and took the other end of the cracker. Fred met his eyes. "Ready?" Percy swallowed. "All right." They pulled. The cracker snapped, popping gently. A small paper crown fluttered out along with a tiny slip of parchment that read, "You are here." "That's something." Percy stared at it. Fred looked away quickly, as if he'd rather be stabbed than admit he'd written something sincere. George cleared his throat. "Don't get used to it." Percy's eyes shone again, but he nodded. "I won't," he said quietly. Fred shrugged, like it meant nothing.
Yeah.
George added, "Eat more pudding." Percy laughed, small and real, and it felt like a crack of sunlight through cloud. The day faded into evening, warm and slow. The Burrow dimmed outside, snow-reflecting moonlight. Inside, the fire glowed. The tree blinked softly. People dozed in chairs. Molly sat with her knitting again, quieter now, content. Harry sat near the fire, the photo album in his lap. He flipped through pages slowly, letting each picture settle in his mind. He felt full in every way, stomach full, chest full, head full of sound and warmth. Ginny sat beside him, shoulder bumping his lightly. "You okay?" she asked. Soft. Harry nodded. "Yeah," he said honestly. "More than okay." Ginny glanced at the album. "Mum worked on that for ages," she said. "She's been collecting photos, like she's building a spell. She wanted you to see yourself." "Here," Harry swallowed. "I do," he said quietly. "I see it." Ginny smiled. "Good." Across the room, Percy was talking quietly with Arthur, listening like he was trying to absorb every harmless, ridiculous detail. Ron watched from the sofa, not smiling. Not relaxed. But he stayed. He didn't leave. And that was something too. Hermione leaned over the back of Harry's chair. "You know," she said softly, "this is what it's supposed to be like." Harry looked up. "What?" "Life," Hermione said simply. "After not perfect, not clean, but real." Harry nodded slowly. Outside, snow fell gently again, soft as ash but without the bitterness. Inside, the Burrow held them all, imperfect and loud and warm. Christmas at the Burrow wasn't a spell that fixed everything. It was something harder and better. It was people choosing each other again, even when it hurt. It was grief and anger and love, all sharing the same table. And for Harry, sitting there with a photo album in his lap and a knitted scarf close by, it was another memory bright enough to keep. Not because it erased the dark, because it proved the dark didn't get the final word.